to all. Today's daf is Nedarim daf Samach Zayin. We are starting Samach Vav Amar Beis on the bottom with the brand new parak. And today's daf is sponsored Lilu Nishmas Marsh Miriam Sarah Bas Rabbi Yaakov Moshe. Her neshama should have an aliyah, and Lilu Nishmas Rabbi Chmil Mordechai. But Rabbi Chaim, his neshama should have an aliyah. Now this parak we begin by talking about hafara, and as we said previously, hafara is when the father or husband, or both of them together, as we're going to soon see, they're mefer, they revoke a woman's nedarim. So let's just get a general idea of what this is. The Psukim tell us as follows: if her father hears her neder and is quiet, her neder is chal. If her father protests her neder the day that he heard it, the pasuk says lo yakum, her neder is not established. Now let's say she gets married and makes a neder, it's the same. If her husband is quiet, her neder is chal. If he protests, it's not. As we said, this is the very general outline of hafara, and we're going to be learning many specifics, such as until what age does hafara work for a father? Do the husband or father actually have to hear the neder the day she makes it in order for hafara to work? And other things as well. So Mishnah says as follows: Nara hamurasa, a nara who went through erusin. A nara is a girl who's between 12 and 12 and a half years old, and she went through erusin. Means she accepted kiddushin. She's not a full-fledged nesua yet. She's not fully married yet, as it means she's partially in the jurisdiction of her father, partially in the jurisdiction of her husband, of her aros. So what's her status regarding nedarim? Aviha ubayla mefir nedareha. Her father and her husband have to jointly be made for her nedarim. Now the Mishnah just mentions nara to emphasize that if she was a bageres, her father is not able to be made for her nedarim anymore. The Mishnah continues, Samach with alpha on the top. Hafer ha'av v'loy hafer ha'bal. Let's say the father was made for her neder, but the husband wasn't. Hafer ha'bal v'loy hafer ha'av. Or the husband was made for her neder and her father was not. Einay mufer. Her neder is not mufer. Ve'ein zar chloimer shekayim echem mehem. And for sure we don't have to say this if one of them was making her neder, if he approved her neder. In other words, the Mishnah is telling us if one of them was quiet, even though the other was made for the neder, the quiet approval of the neder overrides the hafara. So I think Gemara begins by asking, Hainu Reisha, that's the same thing as the Reisha of the Mishnah of Yilu Bailo Mefir Nedareha. The Reisha of the Mishnah says very clearly that her father and her husband are made for her nedarim together, which means that if one of them was made for it and one of them wasn't, of course her neder is not mufar. So Gemara says, no, Ma'oditema, you might have thought if we only had the Reisha of the Mishnah, Oya Viha, Oya Bailo Katani, that the Mishnah is really telling us that either her father or her husband is able to be made for her neder when she's in Arusa, Kamash Malon. That's why the Sefer of the Mishnah comes along to emphasize and tell us very clearly that it has to be both her father and her husband jointly being made for her neder. I think Gemara continues explaining the Mishnah. We had said, Ve'ein tzar chlemer shekiyem echem mehen. You don't even have to say that if one of them was mekayim her neder, even though the other one was made for her neder, then hafar is nothing, and her neder is mekayim. The Gemara asks, why does the Mishnah have to teach us that? Hashta yesh leimar hafer zeh b'loy zeh v'loy klum. Once the Mishnah already told us that if one of them was made for it and the other one wasn't made for it, so the hafar is nothing. So kiyem echem mehen lamali. Why does the Mishnah have to tell us that if one of them was actively mekayim the neder, then the neder is mekayim and it's not mufar? In the case when one of them gives a silent approval, her neder is approved. So for sure, when one of them gives a verbal approval, of course it's approved. The Gemara answers, no, tzricha missing. We have to have that case. Ki itzrichle. What do we need it for? Kigain, for example, the hafer echem mehen. One of them was made for her neder. The kiyem echad, and one of them was actively mekayim her neder. B'chazar hamekayim v'nishal al kamasai. But then the one that was mekayim her neder went and he was shoyal on his akama. He went to the chacham or he went to bezdin and he said, I feel bad that I was making her neder. I want you to take that away. So they retroactively took away his hakama. So ma'adatema, you might have thought, ma'adu uki ha'akre, that which he had established her neder was now uprooted, and now if he goes and is made for her neder, it's considered a valid hafara, because now we have both parties, the father and the husband, being made for a neder. Kamash Mulan, the end of the Mishnah is telling us, the mefir and shnehem baz achaz, both of them have to be made for her neder at one shot. Now that doesn't mean they have to do it simultaneously at the same exact time, it just means that both of them have to be made for her neder, and we can't have a situation where one of them was making her neder, and then he was shoyal on that, and only then was made for it afterwards. It has to be that both of them had the same thought process, they were made for her neder right away, and they weren't making it at all. And that's what the Sefer of the Mishnah is telling us. And the Gemara continues explaining, we had said, how do we know that? How do we know that the father and the aros have to be made for her nedarim together? So Amar Rabbi, he says, Amar Krab, because the pasuk tells us, and if she's tiyah ish, meaning if she gets engaged and her nedarim are on her, what do we learn from here? We learn that a nar marasa, her father and her husband, have to jointly be made for her nedarim. Now, how is it that we learn it from that pasuk? So let's get this clear. We have 3 psukim. The first one talks about a father being made for his daughter's nedarim. The next 2 psukim discuss a married woman making a neder. The first pasuk, which is the one that we just quoted, says Vim hayati ish. The other pasuk is Vim beis isha nadara. Now, what Rabbi is saying is that there's no reason to have 2 different psukim talking about the same case. We don't need 2 separate psukim talking about a married woman and that her husband is able to be made for a nedarim. So it must be that the first pasuk of Im Hayatia, the one that we just quoted, is referring to an Arusa, and we learn from the Vav of the Im Hayatia that it's a continuation of her status before she was married, because the psukim before that are talking about when she was a single girl living in her father's home, so that the Im Hayatia Ish is a continuation of that, and so we learn from there that when she's an Arusa, both her father and her husband have to jointly be made for her Nedarim. Now, just a sneak preview to the end of the Gemara, we're going to end up sticking with this drasha, but we're going to have a bunch of questions in the middle. So the Gemara asks its first question, who says that this pasuk is talking about an Arusa? Emo, let's say, Hai Krab Nesua Ksiv, that this pasuk of Vim Hayatia is talking about an Nesua, meaning she's fully married. The Gemara says that can't be because Imishum Nesua, if you want to say the pasuk's talking about a fully married woman, Krachrina Ksiv, we have a totally different pasuk that says Vim Beis Isha Nadara, and that pasuk is talking about a married woman. So the Gemara suggests, Emo Travaya B'Nesua, maybe both of those psukim are talking about a married woman. And v'chitim, if you want to ask, Trei Kroi B'Nesua Lamali L'Meimar, what would we need to have two separate psukim talking about a Nesua for? I could tell you why we would need both of them. Sheina Baal Mefer B'Kaidmin. I could say that the second pasuk that's talking about Nesua is telling us that her husband is not to be made for her Nedarim that she made before they were married. That's what Kaidmin means, the Nedarim that she had prior to her marriage. So it's possible to interpret both of these psukim as talking about Nesua, and Memela, we would not have a pasuk telling us that an Arusa has to have both her Aros and her father being made for her Nedarim. So Gemara Sam Zaino and Beis on top says that's not so, because V'lav Memela Shamas Mina, wouldn't we learn this Memela from the pasuk? Meaning, you're right, the second pasuk of Nesua could be teaching that a husband may not be made for Nedarim she made before their marriage. However, we would still see Memela from there that her husband has the ability to be made for her Nedarim, so why would we need the second pasuk of Im Hayatia to teach us that? It must be that the second pasuk is referring to an Arusa. Or Ibai Same, alternatively we could say the Havaya Kiddushin Mashma. This lashon of Havaya Vim Hayatia, that's the lashon of Havaya that implies Kiddushin and not Nisuin. So therefore the second pasuk is talking about an Arusa. The Gemara continues asking, fine, we know what the second pasuk is talking about an Arusa, but Emma, why don't we say that Avl Chudei Mefer, that when she's an Arusa, her father is able to be made for her Nedarim on his own. If the husband wants to get involved, the husband needs to do it along with the father. But the father still has ability to be made for her Nedarim on his own. The Gemara says that can't be, because in Cain, if so, Va'asra Isar B'Vesavia Yoni Isa Lamali, what would we need the previous psukim for that talk about her making a neder when she's only in her father's house and she's not in Arusa yet? What would we need those psukim for? Hashti Shleimer B'Makam Aris made for Avl Chudei. Now that based on your suggestion, we're saying that the father is able to be made for a Nedarim on his own when she's in Arusa, meaning her Aris has a little bit of jurisdiction over her, but still the father is able to be made for a Nedarim on his own. Shalai B'Makam Aris Mibaya. If there's no Aris here, if she's not engaged yet, of course her father would be able to be made for a Nedarim on his own. What would we need those psukim for to tell us that? So Gemara has a different suggestion. Ema, why don't we say that Avli by Aras, Va'aras l'chudei mefer. Maybe when she's in Arusa, her father, if he wants to be made for a Nedarim, he needs to do that along with the Aras. But if the Aras wants to be made for a Nedarim, he could do that on his own without needing the father. And Mechitim, if you want to suggest Avdikas Rachmano Lamali, what would we need to have the psukim by father for? I could always say me by lay that we would need those psukim to tell us the Hakim, that if the father is making her Nedarim, then it's a valid Hakama, and her Aris is not able to do anything about it. So Gemara says it's also not a valid limud, because in Cain, if so, Beis Isha Nadara L'mai Kasav. Why would we need to have that last pasuk that says Beis Isha Nadara, talking about her making a neder while she's fully married? We wouldn't need that pasuk, because Kal V'chaimer, we would have a Kal V'chaimer. Uma b'makam av, in the situation when the father still has jurisdiction over her because she's only in Arusa, Aros Mefer L'chudei, her Aros is able to be made for a Nedarim on his own, Shaloi b'makam av mibaya, when the father has no jurisdiction whatsoever because she's a full-fledged Nesua. You need to tell me that her husband's able to be made for her Nedarim on his own? Of course he's able to be made for Nedarim. So if you want to say that her Aros is able to be made for her Nedarim on his own, so we wouldn't need a pasuk to say that when she's in a Nesua, her husband's able to be made for a Nedarim on his own. The Gemara continues suggesting, Ema, why don't we say that the pasuk of in Beis Isha Nadara, which again is the pasuk that's referring to when she's a full-fledged Nesua, her